Hey guys, we've been asked to use videos as a way of teaching, continuing our teaching and making connection with you guys. And the truth be told, I am not at all comfortable with this for so many reasons. But I just watched a great movie that I'm going to recommend to you, and you will laugh, but it is Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And in that movie, Tom Hanks, by the way, plays Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers is just so kind and authentic that he really does not fear things. He sees everything as kind of an opportunity to connect with other people. So I'm trying to channel my Mr. Rogers and to be brave and to see myself as surrounded by neighbors, and that those neighbors are thinking loving, neighborly Christian thoughts as I go about doing something I'm completely crazy uncomfortable with. So what I'm going to do today is just not prepare. I think I have been putting this off because I didn't know how to prepare. And when I don't know how to do something, quite frankly, I shut down. So I'm going to rise to the occasion and we're just going to talk. I've got my coffee, I've got my whiteboard, I've got my notes. I haven't prepared anything. I'm just going to talk for a while. So here's the thing. You guys are going to be writing a paper, and the prompt will be something along the lines of proving that Raskolnikov is befitting, that his name is befitting to his character. And as you know, his name means schismatic or divided. And Raskolnikov is a man divided. He's divided in his innermost being. He is trying to choose between two different worldviews, two different life philosophies, if you will. And for the sake of simplicity, we're going to call those Plan A, or I should not Plan A and Plan B, Path A. See, I already made a mistake. Path A and Path B. And again, to keep it simple, because he goes back and forth so much, and that's one of the things that I want you guys to be paying attention to. Path A is going to be remembered as atheism, and path B is going to be the path of belief. So we've talked about what nihilism is and existentialism and how those are related. And this is where Raskolnikov is. He has been raised a Christian. He has always had faith in God. He's a Russian. Russians were Orthodox, and Dostoevsky is a believer, and Raskolnikov has been a believer, but he's looking to throw off belief in favor of this new idea. And so the story starts out with him being afraid or contemplating what it is that people fear. Why do people fear uttering a new word, having a new way of looking at the world? So whenever he's talking about uttering a new word or throwing off convention, he's talking about the rejection of God himself, belief in the God of the Bible, in favor of a moral system that really isn't a moral system at all, an ethical, philosophical worldview that's predicated on nothing more than doing what one thinks is in his best interest, or perhaps the overall interest of others. And we'll see that morphs a little bit as the story evolves. But in the beginning, he's just very much a utilitarianist or a nihilist who wants to believe that there is no moral code, no objective moral code that can in any way limit his absolute freedom. So this is a story about him committing a murder, but in having committed the murder, he actually is committing a type of self-murder, a type of suicide, a type of spiritual suicide. And it's just a great and compelling story. So today, all I want to do is maybe throw a few quotes out there that I think are important. You can stop the video at any time and write this down if you think that it might be valuable in writing an essay the week after next, or maybe even this upcoming week, I haven't decided, on Raskolnikov's inner conflict. So let's take a look at the vacillations, the back and forth that take place in book 1, which is what, 7 chapters. So the first thing that happens Let me read something to you first from my notes here. Raskolnikov's theory is that he will gain true freedom and power, be it to do good or evil, if and only if he is able to free himself from the moral law. But the moral law proves to be stronger than he anticipates or desires. This is Raskolnikov's tragedy. The murder, though, is the cataclysmic event needed to shake his intellectual crust so as to release the moral lava buried deep within, such that his thinking leads to his suffering and to his potential redemption. One more paragraph. Dostoevsky wrote in his preparatory notes for Crime and Punishment, "There is only one law, the moral law. It cannot be ascertained through reason or science, but is instead made known through the law of human conscience. It is possible for someone lacking a moral sense to shed blood without the pangs of conscience, and those who do not possess any moral understanding of the world can commit crimes without feeling any tragedy of the soul. But Raskolnikov is a human being with a conscience, and a conscience that avenges itself on him for his flouting of the moral law in pursuit of his principle." This principle being that he should be able to commit a murder if doing so promotes his best interest, or if it accomplishes more good than evil. So that's his experiment. That's his great idea. Later on, you're going to learn that he believes in something more than utilitarianism. Hold on one second. Just like in real class, it just got too hot. That's because I'm wearing a coat because just because I do. Okay, so what was I just saying? I already forgot what I was saying. Let's just get back on track then. Oh yeah, so he starts out thinking that his motivation is utilitarian. And then you're going to see in part 2, which you're about to start, that he wakes up after the murder and realizes that I think he stashes the money that he stole from the pawnbroker, but then he ends up throwing it away or does something. And so he realizes in that moment that he didn't really care about the money or what the money could buy. So his motivation was not utilitarian. It turns out that it was something different. The theory that he's testing is this idea of what later came to be called the Übermensch theory. And it's that idea that there are certain people who are fated to be great, so great that the law simply does not apply to them. And he very much wants to believe that he is one of those most excellent people to whom the law does not apply. And every time he senses weakness in himself, every time he feels his conscience rising up and convicting him of some wrongdoing, or even more interesting, every time he has a thought that is dependent on there being some sort of moral code in the world. For example, the fact that his mother and sister would be willing to sacrifice for him. Sacrifice for another is a type of love and compassion, which actually requires that there be a moral hierarchy in the world. So for him to accept their kindness and their willing to sacrifice on his behalf, for him to be comfortable with that would mean that he really did not believe that the world was not designed with a moral hierarchy. So we'll look at that. That's actually one of the things I very much want to look at today. So let's get on to that. First thing that happens, well, the book opens with him having been contemplating this idea of murder for about a month. He's just a young guy, just an intelligent college student, very poor, but full of himself, full of ideas, like college people can be, young men especially. And he thinks, why not? What's wrong with this idea that if somebody does something and it produces more good than bad, that makes it a good action? And he knows about this pawnbroker, and he knows she's just not a pleasant person, and he thinks the world would be better off without her. So he's been thinking about this. This is the new word that he wants to utter, and he's been thinking about this for a long time. So when the book opens, he's going to make a trial run. He makes the trial run, and he leaves her house feeling horrible, he says, he's shocked that he was capable of even having such a horrible desire. He's filled with self-loathing. So that's our first move. The first path A, he starts out on path A by contemplating the murder. See, this is going all right, don't you think? I'm actually just pretending I'm Mr. Rogers and I'm putting on my cardigan and we're just having a talk about the neighborhood, Raskolnikov's neighborhood. So contemplating the murder, okay? That would definitely be, have him on path A. If you find yourself thinking about murdering someone, you're probably on path A. So then he, after the trial run, let's just say post-trial run, he denounces his thoughts I'm going to use shorthand and I'll just say will not murder. So if you were here, I would ask you what changes his mind. But since you're not here, I guess I'll have to ask all the questions and give all the answers. It's really quite boring. It is what it is. Okay, so what happens? What happens that changes his mind? Why doesn't he just call it a day? Well, he goes in. Did you notice? I never remember what I asked you on the reading guides, but I think we talked about this. When he decides he's not going to do that. Do you remember how in the beginning he's all isolated and described as being in those cramped quarters, and he's irritable, and the walls are yellow. Everything has this picture of decay and death. And that is a pathetic fallacy being used to describe his character, his moral landscape. And that's why I asked you to look at that, because Dostoevsky from the get-go lets us know what Dostoevsky thinks of Raskolnikov's thinking. And he does it from the get-go, which is just so interesting. Anyway, so he's all isolated and weird, and there's just so many great Bible verses. If we had more time, we could find some great verses about how when we separate ourselves from God, we do become isolated, that we are called to be in community with others. And we talked a little bit about that, about Dostoevsky's view of when you are right with God vertically, then you will want to be right with other people horizontally. So I've heard people talk about fatherhood and brotherhood, and that's kind of that idea there. So after he has been all isolated and cramped and sick and sleepless and just in turmoil, he decides he's not going to commit the murder, and all of a sudden he feels like being with other people. So he goes into the tavern. Russians are big drinkers. He goes into the tavern because he wants to be with others, and he starts to have this conversation with Marmeladov, who's this impoverished drunkard. Remember, Dostoevsky originally wanted to write a book about drunkenness and poverty in Russia, and he started this book about the Marmeladovs, and he ended up just incorporating them into this much bigger, much more significant story that became Crime and Punishment. So he has this conversation with Marmeladov. Marmeladov is telling him all his problems, what a horrible person he is, and how badly he treats his wife, and how his family is suffering. And then they walk home together, and Raskolnikov meets Marmeladov's family. We get to know his wife, and more importantly, we meet his daughter Sonia, also called sometimes Sophia. Remember, if you get confused about the names, look at that sheet I gave you about all of the Russian names, and I'll try to help you as we go. But Sonia is this good-hearted, loving, sacrificial angel, if you will, who has unfortunately been forced into a life of prostitution. Prostitutes had to get a yellow ticket to indicate that they were in prostitution or something like that. So she has a yellow ticket, and she's just deeply, deeply shamed. She's not a harlot. She's doing this. She's sacrificing her purity and her integrity or her reputation in order to put food on the table because her father isn't doing his job. Poignant, really hard. Raskolnikov looks around, and when he leaves for the evening, he takes what little money he has, I don't know, a couple of kopecks or rubles or something. If you're interested, you can look up how that works, how Russian money works, but I think it was just a couple of rubles. He had very, very little, and he kind of throws it down on the windowsill, as I recall, and leaves. And what is significant about that is that that's very much an act of compassion. So for Dostoevsky, compassion is rooted in love for others. And love for others is always rooted in faith in God and believing that the world has moral hierarchy to it, that God has designed the world, and that his law of love is all controlling, all encompassing. So what does he do after he throws the money down and he leaves? Oh my gosh, all of a sudden he freaks out. He does this over and over again. And he says, what did I do? What was I thinking? That was the last little bit of money I had. I never should have done that. I was a fool. And then he's kind of chastising Marmeladov. He says, men, they get used to anything. No matter how bad things are, that somehow they manage to get used to it. And he doesn't mean this as a compliment. It's actually a judgment, a condemnation of this. But then he says, but what if man is not a scoundrel? Then all is prejudice. And I gave you guys the quote. I don't have it right here, but I want you to pay attention to that scene. That's something you will want to talk about in this upcoming paper. So what does that mean? Why is that such a big deal? He says, if man is a scoundrel, being a scoundrel is not a good thing. Being a scoundrel is being evil, being weak, it's just bad. To be a scoundrel is bad. So, but that would mean if there is such a thing as bad, then there is such a thing as good. And so if man is a scoundrel, if man is not a scoundrel, he says, then all is prejudice. And what he means by that is religion is false. Or am I saying that right? He's saying that that's all we have, that